Hi, it's Lauren. Welcome back to my craft room. Today is a new Whimsy Stamps release day, and I am sharing some of the new products. We have the Howling Night die set, as well as the new 6x6 paper pack called Nevermore, featuring very spooky, realistic images on this paper pack. And I want to create a night scene, so I'm going to use that paper that was in the front of my pack to create a fun scene, or I guess not a fun scene, a spooky scene. I've die cut all of the images out from the Howling Night die set, and I'm just going to share here of how they are supposed to kind of layer together. So we have our graveyard scene, and that is actually just a border die cut. So I have a good chunk of paper there underneath my graveyard. We have a cliff and a spooky tree, two wolves, a werewolf, and a moon. And the cliff and the moon are not only die cut, but there's also an embossed texture to them, which is really cool. So I have kind of figured out how I'm going to layer everything onto my card. So I'm going to trim that 6x6 paper pack down to an A2 size of 4¼ by 5½, and I'm layering everything. And the tree is just too tall for what I'm going for. This die set is really great for slimline cards, but I wanted to put it on an A2 size, as that tends to be most of the cards that I make, and I wanted to see how everything would layer together on a smaller card. I'm going to add some dimension to my cliff here, so I brought out Evergreen Bough, and I am just distressing that onto my kind of tealishy cardstock here, and it really brings out that texture from the embossing of that die. And I'm going to repeat the same process with my moon using Fossilized Amber, but I'm only going to go on one side of the moon and really trying to create a crescent look, like there's the shadow on the other side of the moon. And of course we need to splatter, so I'm going to bring out my very, very little sparkle silk. I'm almost running out here. And I sprinkled that on my moon, and then I brought out my silver silk and sprinkled that onto my cliff piece. So I'm going to set those aside to dry and start working on assembling my card base a little bit while they dry. So I'm going to glue down this patterned paper or printed paper onto a top folding A2 card base and make sure that's nice and adhered. And then we're going to work on starting to glue everything together now that my splatter has dried. I'm going to glue this grassy piece to the top of my cliff, and I'm going to put it as low as possible, just again trying to make sure I have plenty of room on my card. So I'm putting that so it will cover the cliff piece but also allows it to not be super tall on my card. I'm going to glue this down to the very bottom corner, and I am going to just trim off that excess black paper in just a minute here. Just deciding where I'm going to put my moon. I really want some of the silhouette of my werewolf to kind of cover the moon. So I'm going to glue the moon directly down to my card base, just using some wet glue. Again, trying to make sure that it looks like that shadow of the moon is kind of behind the moon. And I'm going to pop up my cliff piece, so I'm bringing out my foam strips and I'm just going to layer that whole thing up. And I also trimmed off that excess of the cliff that was hanging off the side there, and I want that to be flush with the right side of my card, and again that bottom point of my cliff to be at the bottom part of my card. Just make sure I have plenty of room on the top for my werewolf. Now the bottom piece, I'm going to put that on the bottom of my card, and I want to make sure that I can see the cliff, but I also don't go too low to where there's the little divot, I guess you could say, in my graveyard is gonna be exposed at the bottom of the card. So I figured out where I wanted it, flipped it over, and used a pencil just to cut where I want to trim the piece of paper. And this border die actually just barely fits on an A2 size. It's just wide enough for A2. So I'm not going to trim off the ends here. I'm going to wait until I have it secured and adhered to my card, but I wanted to make sure that my edge was flush to where I wanted it to be on the bottom of my card. I'm going to bring out that foam tape again and put a bunch of foam tape on there, except for where it will overlap on that cliff piece. I just used some wet glue, and I'm adhering this down to the bottom edge of my card base, again trying to line up the edges of my dies to the edge of my card base. I'm also going to use some wet glue instead of a little foam square there to adhere that cross so it's up against my cliff because they are the same height on the card. And once it's starting to dry, I'm just going to trim off the edges here so that way my graveyard border scene is flush with all three sides of my card there. So I'm going to clean up a little bit because I'm getting a bunch of release paper everywhere, and now I'm going to place my werewolf. I kept wanting to call him Wolverine or Wolfman. For some reason, I couldn't think of werewolf. It like dawned on me earlier today, but it is a werewolf. And I'm using foam tape to pop him up, except on his feet where he will overlap on the cliff there. And I'm going to make sure that that silhouette is really showing in the moon. I just think that looks so cool. I'm going to trim off the excess of my moon that is on the top of my card. And that was all I was planning to do, but I really wanted to use that spooky tree so badly. I did edit out all the times I tried to add it in and it just wasn't working. So I'm going to bring it in on the left just to add in a little more, like there's a creepy tree branch just looming in the graveyard, and that way it would add a little more of this awesome die cut scene to my card. So I'm applying this directly down, kind of overlapping over the moon just a little bit, and just added a little more to the card, and I'm really glad that I shoved it in there. I'm trimming off the excess just like I did with the rest of my die cuts, and now my scene is pretty much done. And I really wanted to use these two wolves. I thought they were just really fun. So I'm just going to glue them to the inside of my card. So I'm just using some wet glue and I'm going to put them on the bottom. So we have one that is kind of standing and howling at the moon, and then one that's sitting and howling at the moon as well. So you can interchange, you know, maybe you wanted to make a wolf card rather than a, not Wolverine, I almost did it again, a werewolf card. You could have replaced the werewolf image with one of the wolves. To add a little more, I am bringing out my Halloween postage stamp set. There's this little tiny stamp with a trio of bats, and I wanted to stamp it on my moon. So I am using some VersaFine and Onyx black ink, and I'm just testing my stamp because it's the first time I use this little stamp on a post-it note, just like a scrap piece of paper. And I stamped that on my moon, and I really love it. I think it adds a fun touch. And then for my sentiment, I debated what I wanted to do, but I decided on that Happy Halloween sentiment. I stamped it onto some black cardstock and embossed it with white embossing powder. So I used VersaMark and some detail white embossing powder. And I'm trimming this down using my guillotine trimmer so it fits perfectly around my sentiment, this tiny little rectangle. And I'm going to use a foam strip to adhere this to my card. I was kind of debating where to put it, but I settled on that lower left hand area where it was kind of open. And I'm just going to make sure that looks nice and straight, and my sentiment is done. And now to add a little bit of embellishment and a little shine to the card, I'm going to use 3 of these black flat backed pearls that come in my creepy Sparkletz embellishment pack, and just use a jewel picker and some wet glue to glue those down. And then I'm also going to grab my pops of color in this gloss black, and I'm going to put 2 around each pearl, making a little set of 3. You know, they say things in threes look good on cards, so there we have a little set of 3 of embellishments. Now that does make a little bit of a Hershey Kiss look, so I am just tapping the back of it to round out those pops of color. Here is a final look at this awesome werewolf creepy card. I hope you enjoyed this video and you check out all of the new Whimsy Stamps released today. You can use my links down in the description to see everything that I used, as well as to go shopping. If you liked this video, please hit that like button, and if you're new to my channel, I hope I've inspired you to subscribe and come back. Thanks for watching.